It's great to be joined today by Paul Bloom, who is professor of psychology at Yale University and author of the book Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. So this is such a great topic, and it relates to so much of what's going on in the world and the United States today. Let's start by breaking down some of these terms. When we say empathy, what are we talking about? And when you talk about rational compassion, what's the main difference between that and what we see as empathy?
So thanks for having me on, David. And you began in an excellent way because people use empathy in all sorts of ways. And, as long as we're clear what we're talking about, we could have a productive discussion. So I'm using empathy as many people use it to refer to the feelings of others, experiencing the experiences of others, often feeling their pain, feeling their suffering. And I distinguish this. I argue that that's a very bad way to live our lives. It leads us to all sorts of mistakes, political mistakes, personal mistakes. It makes us worse people. And I contrast that with what I call rational compassion. And rationals make sense enough. It's sort of figuring out what to do based on an appreciation of cost and benefits and moral principles. And compassion is the motivator. You need something to motivate you to do good. And compassion is caring about other people. But you can care about other people without feeling their suffering, just by loving them or feeling close to them or wanting them to their lives to be better. And I think that's a better moral force.
And talk a little bit about how that might be applied to some of the regular political discussions that are had. And what came to mind as I was sort of thinking about our conversation is, it seems to me that particularly since people tend to often live, at least politically, sort of in echo chambers that often are
Yeah.
confirming their pre-existing biases, selective empathy, for lack of a better term, might actually create pretty significant bias in people in favor of maybe groups or individuals that they're already familiar with, and may not lead to optimal sort of political decisions. Am I sort of on the right track there?
You're exactly on the right track. I think empathy is by its very nature selective. You can force yourself to feel empathic towards somebody who looks different from you, is in a different country, or is your political enemy. But it's hard. It's much more natural to feel empathy for your friends, for attractive people, for people who look like you, for your same race, your same country. And empathy is inherently biased. And so we see this in the political realm all the time. When people want to make arguments, for instance, for violence and cruelty and war, often the way they do so is by generating empathy for people close to you as a way to motivate outrage from people to people far away from you. We saw a bit of that in 2016 with anti-immigrant rhetoric,
Hmm.
where a lot of the rhetoric was tilted by saying, look, we want you to feel the suffering of people who are going to lose their jobs, people who are assaulted and raped by immigrants. And this sort of empathy is used to motivate anger against a group. Well, the way any reasonable discussion of immigration should take place is in terms of cost benefits. Who do we have an obligation for? What's the best way to make the world better? But appeals to empathy just muddy things at best, and at worst lead to some really nasty behavior on the part of people.
Well, to take that example, I mean, everything you're saying makes sense, but what seems to be maybe missing, maybe not deliberately so, but what I think might make sense to think about is some of the language you're using starts to take on a sort of utilitarian message or paradigm. This idea that we should just measure, we should try to remove emotion and measure as practically as possible, as objectively as possible, the
Yeah.
cost and benefit of any particular decision. But we know about the pitfalls of strictly utilitarian ways of analyzing situations, don't we?
So I'm kind of a lapsed utilitarian. I'm 90% utilitarian, but I push back on some of the problems you're pointing out. So for instance, I love my kids more than I care about you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, a true utilitarian would say your life is as valuable as my son's, but I'm not a true utilitarian. I think that in some cases there's certain bonds that have a reality and should be taken into account. On the other hand, I think we could do to be a lot more utilitarian. I think that when faced with a situation where if we do one thing, 5 people will die, and we do another thing, 1,000 people will die. I say bring on the utilitarians and
Hmm.
choose the act that kills the fewest people. There are so many cases where we don't pay attention to numbers. The world gets much worse, and we congratulate ourselves for being people of feeling, and at least we're not utilitarian.
The immigration example is interesting because we did a pretty detailed analysis of all of the sort of talking points about why both documented and undocumented immigration are bad for the United States. This included the sort of debunked notion that undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants are more likely to commit crime, the non-existent drain on the economy that exists, all of these aspects. And what I came away with that relates to this issue of empathy is you can actually throw out empathy. You can throw out the argument about whether we should allow people in aside from potentially increased crime or economic detriment to the American economy, because those don't exist. You could actually say merely from a utilitarian perspective, it actually does make sense to have immigrants be a significant part of the American economy. And in some cases, it seems like it actually has the opposite effect, where it's this idea that many of those people who are against immigration have, that I am here and I don't want someone who isn't deserving of what I have to be allowed in, when if we took the utilitarian approach, we might come away with something very different. It's sort of a reverse situation to much of what you're discussing, making bad decisions because of empathy. We should actually not be thinking about it, and we might get to a more rational choice in that particular case.
I totally agree. I think for something like immigration, we should crunch the numbers. I mean, it's not merely crunching numbers because there's also moral questions. What are obligations for people in our own country versus other countries? What if people are immigrants and are refugees because of a mess that we cause? What's our obligation? But a lot of it is number crunching. But your analysis is not going to convince anybody who's been swayed by emotional appeals, particularly by empathic appeals. Basically, any large scale policy is going to have some winners and losers. No matter, I agree with what you're saying, but certainly some immigrants commit crimes.
Sure.
And so so somebody like Ann Coulter will say, I want to tell you a story, and a story be about somebody who's been raped by an immigrant, documented, undocumented, whatever. And many of our audience will listen to that story, and then it will enrage them against immigrants, and they won't care about your numbers. And I'd like to see a world where we'll always be vulnerable to this sort of appeal, but I'd like to see a world where it has a lot less force, it's taken less seriously. We dismiss empathic arguments.
Can you give us some examples? And you have so many that you've talked about. Some are in your book, and some are in other places where you've spoken of areas or instances where empathy distorts judgment, and whether it's from medical care, education, parenting, marriage, whatever you think might be the most interesting examples to some in our audience.
I'll give two super quick examples. We're talking about policy, but it's also everyday life. So take parents. I've been a parent of teenagers for a while. Your teenage son comes up to you and he's freaking out because he hasn't done his homework and it's due tomorrow and there's crisis and he's very anxious. A good parent listens, understands, loves his kid, but doesn't freak out along with the kid, doesn't share the feelings. What so much of what being a good parent is not absorbing the feelings of your kids, not absorbing their pain, but trying to make the world better for them, in some way saying, they're anxious, you're calm, they're sad, you're cheerful. They don't want to do something, you make them do it because it's for their long-term interest. So that's one case. A second case would be a therapist. So you're talking to a therapist and you're very depressed and you're very sad. You want your therapist to understand you. You want your therapist to care about you. You don't want your therapist to get sad. And I guess a third example is a first responder, a firefighter or a cop or something like that, where if you're tremendously empathic in the suffering of other people you experience, you will burn out very quickly. And I've gotten emails and letters from people who have read my stuff and they said, look, you've kind of helped me understand the distinction between empathy and compassion, which is I care about people. That's good. The problem is I feel they're suffering too much, and that's bad.
Any examples with education? I know that's another area where you've spoken about this. How does empathy distort education potentially?
So education is an interesting case because any good teacher has to get in the head of his or her student, have to understand what they know and what they don't know. But again, here too, you need some sort of emotional distance in order not just to be an effective teacher, but to be a moral teacher, to be a good person. I'll give this a sort of very mundane example, which is sometimes students come up to me and they're very upset and they want a higher grade, and they might cry or they might just be upset. I'm at Yale, so we grade pretty easily anyway, but still, they might want a higher grade.
Is that true?
And Oh, yeah. There's great inflation like crazy. We could
Hmm.
talk about that another time.
Yeah.
And I'm being a highly empathic person. I feel their pain, but it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be fair for me to elevate a student's grade simply because he or she is upset, because it's not fair to other students who don't come crying. And here we see just basic fairness uh, requires sort of abstracting away from the particulars, from the particular feelings and emotions of people, and appealing to broader principles.
As a general rule, are there any circumstances you've come across where the variable of whether someone is or isn't crying about something should influence decision making in any way?
It should influence how you act to them. If you have a friend who's weeping, you console them in a different way than if they're not.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly people's emotional responses should matter a lot, but you shouldn't, if you feel them yourself, if a friend comes to you in great pain and then you feel the pain, now you're in great pain too. You've done nothing to help your friend. What you've done actually is you've added a second problem,
Hmm.
yourself. And so what a good friend does is supportive and understanding, is sad because their friend is sad, but tries to respond with their friend's interests in mind. It's a case where empathy is in a sense selfish, where instead of trying to help you if you're in trouble, I become absorbed with my own feelings in response to it, and now I'm dealing with myself.
Hmm. We've been speaking about the book Against Empathy, the case for rational compassion with the book's author, professor of psychology at Yale University, Paul Bloom. Very interesting and very relevant also in today's political world. Thanks so much for talking to me about this.
Thank you for having me on.